This is a Rogue Media Network podcast.
Do you ever have a story that you just can't get out of your head?
One that you play the details of over and over with your friends?
Well, you've come to the right place. I'm Claire.
And I'm Susan.
And this is Justice Pending,
a weekly true crime podcast where we discuss tantalizing crimes with more questions than answers.
Hey, welcome back to another episode of Justice Pending. I'm Claire, and today I have a special guest, Michelle Pitcher. Welcome to Justice Pending.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, so I'm really excited. I've been listening to season 5 of the Unforgotten Riding Shotgun, and I just couldn't wait to talk to you about it because it is such a fascinating and wild ride.
I really appreciate a pun. Yeah, it's been a really interesting thing to report on. And we have put out this 6-episode podcast, and there's still so much left unsaid. So I think if this podcast piques anyone's interest, I mean, this story will keep on going long after the 6th episode airs.
Definitely. So why don't you tell our listeners what this season is all about?
Yeah, so I'll just give you a brief overview of something that happened in 1998 that set the ball rolling here. 2 men drove up to a suburban house in a town called Farmers Branch. It's a suburb of Dallas. Early in the morning, in this wild-looking psychedelic VW Bug, they broke into an elderly woman's house and they shot and killed her. So one of the guys in the Bug was immediately identified. He was the owner of the car, and the passenger ended up being harder to pin down. So there were some witnesses who could immediately ID the driver of the car. His name was Rick Childs. Their best witness described the passenger as looking kind of like that guy, white guy, similar build, longish hair down to his shoulders, but they couldn't get an ID. So they hypnotize her at her request. The police hypnotize her. Still no closer, but she's still describing this white guy with longer hair. She does a composite sketch. It looks a lot like the driver. The passenger looks a lot like the driver. But then police show her a photo lineup of Hispanic men with shaved hair. So obviously the investigation is going in some odd directions. So fast forward to a year later, the police have landed on Charles Don Flores as their suspect. Despite what the witnesses say, they are convinced that the passenger was Charles Flores, who is a Hispanic man with short cropped hair, pretty large set, wears glasses. None of that matches with what people say they saw in terms of the passenger getting out of the car. But
yeah,
he's
it's
arrested.
really interesting just to think that you could start so simply with an eyewitness saying 2 white males, long hair, these are the people I saw. And of course we have to talk about this vehicle that they see because
Yes.
it's very distinct. It is a VW Bug and it's got a really unusual paint job. Tell us about that, Michelle.
It's like a pink and purple paint job where it's like irregular. It looks like there's waves painted on the bottom. It's covered in these bumper stickers that are peace and love, Grateful Dead. It kind of looks like it teleported, like it time traveled into this modest North Texas suburb at the turn of the 21st century. So everyone noticed this car. Everyone who saw this car remembered this car. It was not a discrete vehicle by any means.
And their memory was accurate, right? They remembered this car and they later found this car and it matched the descriptions.
Yes. And when they later found the car, that's a whole new can of worms. So
right.
it is a wild story. So that is the investigation that initially kicked off this, you know, decades long fight for justice.
Yeah.
And police, through some interesting leads, landed on Charles Flores as the guy who they thought was the passenger.
So tell me about Charles Flores. What kind of guy is this? How does he end up wrapped up in this investigation when he doesn't match the eyewitness description at all?
That is a wonderful question. So Charles Flores was in his late 20s. He was living in Irving. He was working a little bit for his dad's company, but he was also moonlighting as a drug dealer. So he was on police's radar. He had a rap sheet. He was, not necessarily a law-abiding citizen who was plucked off the street, but it was this association with police, this his being on their radar, that actually got him wrapped up in this case. The Farmers Branch Police narcotics unit reached out to some surrounding police departments asking, hey, do y'all know who this person could be, this passenger could be, this associate of Rick Childs? Rick Childs had started saying that earlier in the night he had been hanging out with a guy named Charlie, all this. So the Irving Police Department sends over Charles Flores's mugshot. Pretty early in the homicide investigation, homicide investigators are like, this doesn't look like our guy. But the narcotics investigators are like, this matches the intel we're getting from the drug scene. So that conflict goes away somehow. And I'm still not sure what happened. I spoke with one of the initial investigators, and he wasn't super forthcoming about the details of that, but he did indicate that, the disagreement between the departments had happened. But for some reason, police were like, absolutely, Charles Flores is our guy, despite the fact that right after they got his mugshot, they showed it to their best eyewitness, and she did not pick him out of the lineup. She didn't pick anyone out of that lineup.
Yeah. I mean, was there ever any discussion of wearing a wig? Could there have been a disguise going on?
A really good question. It honestly hasn't come up. It would have been an odd choice.
Everything about this case is odd. Who drives a pink and purple VW Bug to commit a murder or even to rob, someone's house? You would think you would want the most nondescript vehicle possible.
It's a really good point too. And a little more detail about this crime. The two people who committed it, or at least Rick Childs, we know was doing some heavy drugs all night leading up to this murder. And it's possible the passenger was too, whoever that was. Charles Flores had actually been doing drugs with Rick Childs that night, including meth, things that don't necessarily lead to great decision-making, but also make it seem like this was a poorly thought out, spur of the moment crime where they drove to this woman's house because they wanted to rob her. So they wanted to get some money that they believed was hidden in the house. So no one's ever really talked about potential disguises. I will say, in addition to the long hair, Charles Flores is a pretty heavy set Hispanic man. He does wear glasses. And those are just two other discrepancies.
Yeah.
I guess if you look at the composite sketch of the passenger, in addition to the hair,
sure,
it simply looks nothing like Charles Flores.
Yeah. So how did you discover this case? How did it end up on your desk?
So you might have heard of Gretchen Swen. She is a defense attorney who she's been in the news for years. She covers or she works on cases that are really difficult. She, in the past couple of years, has been in the news because she has a client named Robert Robertson. who is on Texas death row, came close to execution twice. He was convicted of killing his daughter, who the courts believed died of what's called shaken baby syndrome.
Right.
And it was diagnosed using this really outdated method. There's a lot of reasons to believe that this little girl actually tragically died of illness and
Yeah.
a shortfall from bed. So there's questions about whether Robert Robertson is innocent, whether there was a crime in the first place.
So many
So-
questions that there's a forthcoming John Grisham novel, if I'm not mistaken.
You are correct. And that is coming out next year if all goes according to plan. But as you said, yeah, John Grisham took up the mantle. Dr. Phil spoke in front of Texas legislators. It was a really big deal. And both times that he was set to be executed, it was thwarted. So at the same time, Gretchen has this other case, Charles Don Flores, and he's sitting on death row. He doesn't have an execution date, but the state attorney general's office, out of the blue, while she's fighting this fight with Robert Robertson, sends a letter to Dallas and is like, we think that you should kill this guy. We think that Charles Flores has sat on death row long enough and it's time to set an execution date. And for those who don't keep up with this sort of thing, that's just not how it goes. The attorney general's office wasn't involved in the case. It was a very, very weird step for a state agency to take. So Gretchen Swen is kind of the character, if you will, that led me to the Charles Don Flores case, because I was following her other case. And then, she just had this, she was slammed with this out of the blue urgency on the Charles Flores case while she was juggling all that with Robert Robertson. So it was a weird thing for the state to do. This lawyer was having to fight some really interesting fights, really interesting arguments. And so I decided to look more into the Charles Flores case.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you say that, because Gretchen Swen is hands down my favorite interviewee in this podcast of yours. She's just so tenacious. She's a soundbite machine, as we say. She's a wonderful interview subject. I love how she delivers her lines and everything. I thought, every time she comes on the mic, I'm just smiling because I can just feel her passion.
Yeah. Can I tell you that I wasn't originally going to do this story as a podcast, but I spoke with her and I spoke with a man named John Wickstead, who's an expert in memory. And both of those interviews were just so captivating. And I just felt like people needed to hear them speak
Yes.
so passionately in their own voices. And like you said, just some people are perfect soundbite machines. Some people absolutely
Yes.
know exactly what to say. And Gretchen is one of the most tenacious people I've ever met or interviewed.
Yeah, I was reading an article in Texas Law Magazine where she said, the thing about being a defender of the vulnerable is the vulnerable isn't always who you think it is.
Yeah.
And I felt like that was really applicable in this case.
Yeah. And later in the podcast, I have a source say that when the system fails, it fails everyone.
Yeah.
So in a potential case of wrongful conviction, there are multiple victims. There's the original victim. There's the person who was wrongfully convicted. There's the community who, is kind of forced to live in this limbo of not knowing if there's still someone out there who
Yeah.
poses a threat. There's just, it's easy to want cases to be closed and solved. And it's hard to grapple with the idea that the system can get it wrong sometimes, but there's ample evidence that wrongful convictions do happen. And, just aside from that, people in Texas prisons, regardless of whether they're guilty, are an incredibly vulnerable population. Conditions in Texas prisons are rough. A lot of them live without air conditioning. And I don't know if y'all know this, but it is hot here. Medical care is hard. There's just, you could have a whole nother podcast on the indignities and frankly dangers of Texas prisons. So the vulnerable in our population are often not who you're maybe even most sympathetic toward.
Right. And that definitely is an issue with Charles Flores, just with his violent history and drug use and many things that are not in question that he has done that are very hard to hear.
Mhm.
Attacks that he's had on women, on police officers, on other people. So it's hard to necessarily take up the mantle for Charles Don Flores, but we are a society of law and order and rules. And the idea that because he's a bad guy, we shouldn't be concerned about him being executed for something he probably didn't do, that there's no evidence that he did, is just a really disturbing road to go down, to say, well, he's a bad guy, so it's okay if we kill him for something he didn't do because he's a bad guy anyway.
Exactly.
I don't think that that's a world any of us really want to live in, and it's just really troubling. And it's interesting that you brought up John Wickstead, because I also heard him on the TED Radio Hour.
Did you?
Yeah, a recent episode before you and I'd connected, before I knew about riding shotgun, that it was going to cover the Charles Don Flores case. John Wickstead was speaking to, one of my favorite shows, the TED Radio Hour, and it was an episode called How Does Your Brain Perceive the World?
Mm.
And he talked about Charles Don Flores and this idea that eyewitness testimony has gone really through a whole spectrum of belief in our society. We started out really believing eyewitness testimony. There's an eyewitness. This has to be what happened. And then we went back and said, actually, memory can be tricky. It can be fallible. There can be influences to your memory. And so then we were like, well, we don't trust anyone's eyewitness testimony. It's all incorrect. And then, where we are today, he was saying, is that under certain conditions, when things are followed, most importantly, the initial eyewitness, the initial memory description is the most reliable, directly from the witness's mouth, before they have a chance to have anything else put in front of them, any other influences. That's the eyewitness that we can trust the most. And in this case, it was just so convoluted where the eyewitness started and where it ended up.
Mhm.
And he brought it up on the TED Radio Hour as an example of really troubling eyewitness testimony used to convict someone who otherwise shouldn't be convicted, right? This is like the key evidence, is this eyewitness testimony that really seems to be manufactured.
Yeah, and to be clear, the evolution of this testimony, so we're talking about the neighbor,
Yes.
Jill, who was hypnotized, did this composite sketch of the guy with long hair, didn't ID a passenger, didn't ID a passenger, didn't ID a passenger. A year later, after Charles Flores had been arrested, his face had been all over the news, because, as you alluded to, he went on the run. The FBI was posting his mugshot everywhere. She comes into trial, sees him, and then tells lawyers, I actually can make a 100% definitive ID that he is the passenger. So the only time Jill Arganier ID'd Charles Flores was in court. So what John Wickstead would say is that is by far the least reliable account of her memory, because it's had time to be contaminated.
Yeah.
She admitted to seeing the news reports. She had been hypnotized, which is a whole other can of worms.
Yep.
And so it is interesting because John is very, very adamant that her initial description of this guy with long hair who looked like the driver points to Charles Flores being innocent.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's kind of hard to take up the mantle for Charles Flores based on his criminal history, but John Wickstead is shouting from the rooftops. He wants everyone to know about this situation and what it could potentially mean for
Right.
the future of eyewitness testimony. Um, it's just such a fascinating
It
forensic
is. It
science.
really is. And you think about all the different sort of points of contamination with this witness, this neighbor, Jill, and how she was shown the mugshot of Charles Flores along with all these other Hispanic males really early on, says no. And then it's just like, it almost like keeps the death by a thousand cuts, right? It just
Mhm.
keeps adding up until she gets to trial and he's there in the courtroom. He's obviously the defendant, and it's just really troubling to think that her initial statement was so clear and so different than the one that convicts someone and puts them on death row.
And the jury didn't hear about that evolution of her description. And she just seemed very, very definitive. She said she was over 100% sure on the stand.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Which I want to be clear is not like, I personally wouldn't condemn her as a person for that.
Sure.
I think that there are so many ways that our mind plays tricks on us.
Yeah.
And you can be the most well-meaning, well-intentioned person, and you can be over 100% sure of a memory and be incorrect. And that's borne out by all the research on memory. And so in no way do I want to, cast aspersions or anything like that. But unfortunately, eyewitnesses do get it wrong
Yeah.
for whatever reason.
That's a really good point. We do believe that the witness, the neighbor, Jill, is trying her best to be helpful here and is trying to rack her brain and believes that, what she saw uh, changed, right? That she now believes that she did see this.
Yeah.
And that's really the crux of the problem, right? What memory do we believe of hers? The first one or the last one?
Exactly. And her elderly neighbor was murdered.
Yeah.
And so what Jill saw was two men drive up to her neighbor's house that morning, get out of the car, and then Jill closes her blinds. And she feels horrible that she didn't know that they were driving up to go kill her neighbor.
Yeah.
So she's highly motivated to help. She wants whoever did this to be held to account. She doesn't go out thinking we just got to get any conviction. She's not a lawyer. She's not a
Right.
DA. She is a mother, a neighbor. She works for the city or the county. She is just a normal woman who wants to help. And I think that gets lost in the story.
Totally. Totally. What do you hope listeners take away from your podcast?
I know that this isn't necessarily good to hear, but I hope they're frustrated. I hope that we're able to get into enough of the nuance that people are looking past the knee jerk reaction. The idea that, well, he was a bad guy, so why should we care if he was wrongfully convicted? Well, she said she was 100% sure, so why don't we just believe her? Well,
Yeah.
there are all of these ways in which this case has been portrayed, frankly, by the prosecution and the defense as cut and dried. And I think that the truth is a lot more interesting and a lot more important than that. We really need to be frustrated when the criminal justice system is refusing to take a closer look at a case like this, especially when the stakes are life or death. And in Texas, if you're on death row, you're going to die. You're going to die of natural causes while you wait there, but there's a very, very real possibility that you're going to be executed by lethal injection. We have an active death chamber. So the stakes couldn't be higher. And I hope that people walk away with a better understanding of how and why the machine that puts people on death row malfunctions and can malfunction and does.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. So where can people find The Unforgotten Riding Shotgun?
So it's anywhere where you get your podcasts. You can find it by going to the Unforgotten Show page. It is season 5. You can also just search Riding Shotgun and be sure to start with episode 1. That'll really give you the groundwork that you need to understand the rest of the story because things get complicated.
They do, and there's some fun twists and turns lurking around the corner, including Michelle, you getting hypnotized yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. That was one of the more interesting interviews I've ever done. I did not go in expecting to be hypnotized, but there we are.
I
for the
was totally
for the
picturing
story.
that in a public library, no less.
In a public library. I might not be allowed back, but we'll see.
Well, thank you so much for joining me on Justice Pending. Everyone needs to go listen to season 5 of The Unforgotten Riding Shotgun. And I'll be back next week with an all new case. Stay tuned.
Thank you so much, Claire.
Thanks, Michelle. Justice Pending is recorded in Dallas, Texas for Rebel Studios. It's hosted by me, Claire Sanamaw, and Susan Passoni. Our theme music is Bending Truth, licensed at premiumbeat.com. We appreciate all listener feedback. Leave a review wherever you're listening right now, and we might read it on the air. Thanks for joining us.
This has been a Rogue Media Network production.